As I say, he's going to have 12 minutes or so to lay out his case. Now, it's often struck me that Brecht was pretty right when he said, "Happy is the land that has no need of heroes," and I was trying to think of anyone in British history who was called the Great, and I could only think of Alfred, and I only know him as great because of his baking achievements. Rather in the spirit of the times, I suppose. But why Andrew is going to make the case that Napoleon should be called great. When I Googled what did Napoleon do for France the other day, I learned that he took the country to war, had the country declare him emperor, nationalized anything he felt like nationalizing, and introduced a secret police. Now, we have heard of him, of course. We've all heard of him. He used to be used to terrify children in this country. He certainly won battles. He was, everyone agrees, a brilliant general. He rebuilt cities. He invented a legal system. He's even responsible for the street numbering system, is he not? That still pertains in most of this country, with odd numbers on one side of the street and even numbers on the other. But what is it about this man, who even Andrew, in this very lengthy book, which I had the pleasure of finishing this morning just in time, admits was a pretty sanguinary fellow at times? What is it about him that makes him so great? So, Andrew, tell us why.
Can I borrow the bottom book there?
The bottom? Yeah, we could learn something from it.
I know, it's a wonderful book. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be invited to address you and to answer Jeremy's question. The central point about Napoleon is the way in which he saved France, and to understand the dangers that he overcame in the course of this, I'd like to quote from an extremely good book, Phantom Terror, written by Adam Zamoyski. And what Adam writes on page 77, quite rightly, is, when he became first consul and effective dictator of France in 1799, Napoleon had been faced by indescribable chaos resulting from 10 years of revolution and counter-revolution, internecine political struggle, random political terror, class war, and open civil war in some parts of the country. The authority of the state had been undermined by the rapid succession of governments, each of which overturned the legitimacy of its predecessor. The law had been turned into a tool by rival political factions, and justice had been politicized. Napoleon may have been a product of the Enlightenment and what conservatives saw as its depraved values, but he was a pragmatist. If he did not believe in divine right, he certainly had no time for Jacobin ideology, Illuminati, or dreamers of any kind. He believed in order, and he knew how to impose it. So what did he do with this order? Well, the first thing, as Jeremy pointed out, was the Code Napoleon. He ripped up the 42 often contradictory legal systems that had so held France back, and instead had one single code, which was from then on been able to basically make France into a modern state, and it's been adopted by 40 countries of the world in every inhabited continent. He also created the glories of Paris. When you go on a romantic weekend to Paris, you will walk along the quays that were built by Napoleon the Great. You will cross one of the 4 bridges built by Napoleon the Great. You will see the Vendôme column in the Place Vendôme, or the Arc de Triomphe de Carrousel in the Louvre. It is partly because of him that it is such a glorious and beautiful city today. He built also the useful things like the reservoirs and the sewers. He was a true creator. He created the Banque de France, which is still around, and of course at the time was the reason that he was able to get inflation down from 10,000% a year to 6% a year. He was the man who ended the war in the Vendée, this incredibly vicious war that had claimed 40,000 lives, more than were guillotined in the Terror, and he ended that war. He's the man, Napoleon the Great, who is behind the system of prefects in departments. There were departments, of course, before, but he managed to centralize that system with the prefects, which again we have today. He set up the Conseil d'État, which meets every Wednesday today, able to vet the laws of France. He managed also to organize the first proper public accounting system, and he also reformed the tax code. He did the things that you need to do in order to make a country work. He set up, ladies and gentlemen, the Légion d'honneur, which is still, quite rightly, coveted by Frenchmen. And he also signed the Concordat, which brought to an end the horrific system of discrimination against Christians in the French Revolution, which had led to the desecration of the altars and the deaths of hundreds of nuns and priests. So when his mother, Madame Mère, was asked about Napoleon's achievements, and she said, "So long as they last," she was right in a sense, or at least so long as she lasted. She wasn't to know that they have lasted. They have lasted 200 years, and they alone, quite apart from anything to do with fighting or conquest or wars or battles, mean that when you vote this evening, you should vote yes. They seek to destroy the revolution by attacking my person, he said in 1804 after an assassination attempt of him, one of 30 assassination attempts that he survived. I will defend it, for I am the revolution. And this was right. What he did was to save the best bits of the revolution, equality before the law, religious toleration, the abolition of feudalism, and he got rid of he just swept away the worst parts, the 10-day calendar, the cult of the supreme being, and the terror, the mass guillotinings. And in a sense, one can understand why he felt that it was necessary to do all of this, and why also the British, and indeed the old legitimists, the ancien régime, old reactionary powers, desperately wanted to get rid of him. And it was Spencer Perceval, the British Prime Minister, who wrote in a book entitled, catchy title this, The Observations Intended to Point Out the Application of a Prophecy in the 11th Book of David to the French Power. Publishers wouldn't allow you to get away with that as a title any longer. And this book said that the Bible foretold the death of Napoleon and that the world would end in 1926. When finally Spencer Perceval was assassinated by somebody even more deranged than him in 1812, his mantle as Prime Minister was taken up by Lord Liverpool, who was also completely committed to the destruction of Napoleon. And it was important, of course, to create this bogeyman figure that Jeremy says was used, quite rightly, was used to scare children. But the fact is, 200 years later, we can now appreciate that he was a great man, not somebody that needed to be used for propaganda. He also was a man with a great sense of humour, which you don't get in monsters. He was, when at the opera, an escaped lunatic from a lunatic asylum came up and told him that he was in love with the Empress. Napoleon replied, "You seem to have chosen a curious person for your confidant." And when the Archbishop de Rohan wrote him a letter on the eve of the coronation saying that he would willingly give his life for Napoleon, Napoleon noted on the letter, "Pay 12,000 francs to the Archbishop out of the theatrical fund." And then when all his brothers and sisters were trying to, were arguing and complaining about the various principalities and countries that they'd been assigned in the Napoleonic Empire, Napoleon shrugged and said, "You'd have thought that I'd been misappropriating the legacy of our late father, the king." He wasn't a warmonger. There were 7 wars of the coalition that were declared against him, and he did attack both Spain and Portugal in 1807 and 1808, and of course Russia in 1812. 2 wars that he started against the 7 that were declared against revolutionary and Napoleonic France. If you're looking for an inveterate warmonger, you have to go back to the British, who were funding all of those 7 coalitions to a huge degree, and rightly so. He wanted to invade us. I'm delighted that the British won the Battle of Waterloo. As an Englishman, it set up the British Empire very nicely after 1815, but it doesn't mean that we still have to be in thrall to the old propaganda of the cartoonists, the caricaturists like Thomas Rowlandson and James Gilray and George Cruikshank that make out this man to be a monster. What's more, he didn't have a Napoleon complex. This idea that there was a hubristic concept where he had to go around invading countries is completely absurd. The way in which we try to fit his career into hubris versus nemesis, this old ancient Greek dramatic conceit, just simply doesn't work. The reason he invaded Russia in 1812 was because he had beaten the Russians twice before. He'd fought in blizzards before. He had the largest army in the history of the world. It was the same size as the whole population of Paris, twice the size of the Russians. He had no intention of going to Moscow. He wanted to fight within 20 days along the borders of Russia. He had no idea that typhus was going to kill 140,000 of his men. He had no idea that the Russians were going to fight such a scorched earth policy that they would actually burn down Moscow, or at least 3/4 of it. So, and he tried to stop several times on the way to Moscow. As I say, he had no intention of going there when he started that war. And he did know about the winter, which is why he allowed himself 3 weeks to get back to Smolensk. He made a terrible mistake after the Battle of Maloyaroslavets. But the idea that he had no concept of the Russian winter is absurd. He'd read Charles the 12th, the book by Voltaire, and knew perfectly well that it did. So he's not a matter of hubris. He was defeated. But plenty of people have been defeated in history and are still great. Peter the Great lost the Azov campaign. Frederick the Great lost the Battle of Kolin. Catherine the Great lost the war against Sweden. Alfred the Great lost so many battles, he spent most of his time in the marshes of Athelney. But it doesn't stop them from being great, and neither should it stop Napoleon. He was a great meritocrat. 10 of his marshals came from the working classes, a fact totally unknown in the history of France up until then. They were the sons of coopers and tanners and bailiffs and innkeepers and millers. One of them actually claimed to have had claimed that his father had had a royal appointment, but the royal appointment was in fact the royal mole catcher. So in a sense, you could actually add him as well and make 11 of the marshals. Winston Churchill said that Napoleon was the greatest man of action since Julius Caesar. And I believe his life is a standing rebuke to people who don't believe in the great man theory of history and who think that history is all created, like the Marxists do, by vast impersonal forces. Standing against that, ladies and gentlemen, is the career and life of Napoleon. And one of the midshipmen on HMS Bellerophon, which Napoleon surrendered to and was taken back to Plymouth said, he showed us what one little human creature like ourselves can accomplish in a span so short. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is so true, and one of the major reasons why tonight you should vote yes. Thank you very much indeed.
An uninformed audience. Unexposed to your view anyway.
No, and sorry. And also your view, because in your 2011 book, Empire, you call Napoleon a despot.
He was a despot.
No, he was not a despot. Sorry, this is the moderator, ladies and gentlemen.
Can you just remind us how he was elected?
Well, actually, he had 3 great referendum plebiscites that were slightly fraudulently manipulated. But they were manipulated. He actually won by, we have the actual, the proper voting figures in the National Archives. The great thing is that he won about 80%, but claimed 95%. Now, that is obviously outrageous and disgraceful and despicable, but he still won 80%.
Of those who dared to vote.
Does the word coup mean anything to you?
Yes, yes, it certainly does. Yes, of course, he came to power in a military coup, and thank God he did, because look at all the wonderful things he did for France. Whereas if you try to change the French Constitution in 1799, it would take 3 years. It had to go through both houses of Parliament and be passed 3 years, 3 times. So you actually had to and then have a plebiscite. So you actually took 9 years to change the Constitution. It's absolutely not. What it is an argument for having somebody who is able to cut through all that red tape and actually get things done.
Adam, is there nothing you admire about this man?
Oh no, I was brought up rather admiring him, and I always thought, there was something very sort of dashing about him. But the more one...
He was very short to dash, really, wasn't he?
No,
when he was young, he was sort of quite sexy in a way. But
this is so wrong.
He wasn't a short ass.
No, he was not a short ass. He was 5 foot 6.
Was he taller than you?
He was exactly my height, in fact. When I was making this BBC TV series, I actually, when nobody was looking in the room in which he died, I lay on his deathbed, and my feet just touched the end of the bed. He's exactly the same height. The reason people think that he's tiny is because of all those caricaturists who constantly made him minute against huge John Bull figures and George III figures. He was the exact average age for a Frenchman of his time.
No, people were always remarking that he was of small stature.
Only tall people.
And he was very puny.
Okay, apart from his stature, is there anything you admire about him?
He was capable of acts of generosity. He did do some very, he did win some extraordinary battles. He did do some stuff.
Look, he got defeated. It doesn't stop you. As I mentioned earlier, all these other people who were still called the Great who got defeated. But he won 46 of his 60 battles. And that is an astonishing achievement for anyone. Yes, of course, the ones that really mattered, the ones at the end, the Battle of Waterloo, he lost, and he deserved to lose, as I say in the book. That was a series of blunders.
The really important ones he didn't win, and that's the trouble.
By the way, when you criticise Marengo, that is completely outrageous. When you say, and then reinforcements happen to arrive, who asks for the reinforcements? He did. He went from that moment that he realised the Austrian attack was taking place at 9:30 in the morning. He sent out the demands to Destinée to return to the battle, and they did it at the key and decisive moment. So it's not fair, really, to slag off 46 victories and make such a fuss of 7 defeats.
How many deaths do you think he should have on his conscience?
All of the ones in Russia.
That's 500,000.
Which is 500,000, but not the 3.5 million that died in the Napoleonic Wars, in wars that were declared on him or his allies.
So a mere 500,000.
Compared to a seventh of the number of people who died.
There's also a small detail of the hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths as a result of the Russian campaign. And indeed of civilian deaths in France as a result of the...
Oh, speaking of the battles in France, when you say that I think I've got the exact quote here. Hang on a second. You say that as he got on and as he got slower, he got worse and worse and worse. What about the 4 victories in 5 days in the 1814 campaign? That was one of the great campaigns in history. It's as good as anything he did in Italy 20 years earlier. He was not getting worse. He was just getting fewer soldiers. He had 70,000 against 350,000.
He was just getting sloppy and lazy.
If he's invaded, or his allies invaded, as in the War of the Third Coalition in 1805, what's he supposed to do? Just sit back and allow that to happen? Of course not.
He was a menace.
He was not. You see, despot, menace. This is the moderator. He was. also not a menace to anyone. He never went to war with anyone.
Really?
Between 1800 and 1805, throughout the entire consulate, first consulate, he did not go to war with anyone, and what happened? The Austrians invaded and attacked Bavaria, his ally.
Because he was a menace.
Well, it's because he was taking over Spain and Italy and dominating half of Europe and ruining everybody with his wretched blockade. People were, people
Who started the blockade? The British with the Orders in Council. That also, the
Yes,
protectionism that ultimately did bring him down.
But he didn't have to do tit for tat. You don't always have to, just because
You fight a protectionist war by just allowing them to put tariffs on your business, and then you do nothing to their trade whatsoever. Come on, when's that ever happened?
Okay, let's look at something beyond military, though.
Yes.
You would accept, wouldn't you, that this man's legacy in terms of science, in terms of urban planning, in terms of the law, this is significant.
The fact is that he was the one who set up the great scientific prizes. He was the one who, for the first time in French history, made scientists into important people in society, gave them peerages. You know, the first scientist that we ever made a peer in this country? Lord Kelvin in 1896. The first artist who ever got a peerage was Lord Leighton in 1892. The first poet he made these great men into great men, and the first poet in this country was Tennyson in 1884.
Why
that
are you
is
such a fan of
ridiculous.
peerages?
It's because it's a way of thanking people. Oh, by the way, he brought in life peerages, which we didn't do in this country till 1958.
That's good, is it?
Yes, it's a way of. Well, what, you prefer the hereditary version that we had in this country at the time?
Some of us are Democrats, you know.
The point is that he unleashed so much human potential through his belief in meritocracy that he is definitely worthwhile. It's astonishing this debate is taking place. He, of course, deserves the title the Great.
Some of the arguments are certainly astonishing.
When he used to tug people's ears and squeeze their noses, we have this in
Oh, they
so
loved
many
it,
yes, there are accounts in there, and one of them is in my book where the guy comes away and shows his men after the parade. He goes, "Look, the emperor. This is what the emperor did to me. He loves me. He knows me. He was never went to blood. Show me a single place where there's blood."
A culture of sycophancy that is quite disgusting.
Not in the slightest. No, he was a genuinely charismatic figure, and they quite literally adored working with him. His friends, when you said he didn't have friends, what an outrageous remark to make. You didn't mention Bessières, you didn't mention Destinée. He had plenty of people he was able to be friendly with. The drawback was, of course, that they all died in battle. All four of them died in battle. And so, yeah, as his life went on, he had fewer and fewer friends, but it doesn't mean that he was incapable of the concept of friendship.
What about his incompetence with women?
Well, he himself claimed to have had 6 or 7 mistresses. I've named 22 in that. So if that's incompetence, hey.
Right.
Yes, I mean, there weren't mistresses, 22. I mean, there were girls he slept with because he'd come along and say, "Come along, I'm emperor," and he'd give them one. But, I mean, that's not exactly a mistress. Yeah, he was much loved by 2 very stupid women, Marie-Louise, his second wife, and Marie Walewska, his bonus.
And Josephine wasn't the brain of Britain either.
She didn't really love him.
No, that's true. She didn't really love him. It's a much more complex story than the kind of Romeo and Juliet love story much more complex and much more interesting and much more human in my view as well. Whilst also at the same time getting involved in Corsican politics, which, as Adam quite rightly pointed out, he was very bad at. And the whole family got chased off the island in 1793. What Adam didn't mention, also happened in 1793, a few months later, was that he commanded the artillery at the siege of Toulon, and in a brilliant immediate aperçu, as soon as he went up to the top of the eaglet above the heights of Toulon, he saw how, if you captured a particular battery, you were able to force the British out of the harbour, which he managed to do. When he'd done his reading and understood the importance of France and the Enlightenment and his own belief in Enlightenment concepts and reading of Rousseau, that he came intellectually over to appreciate that that Corsica was a cause he believed in, but was not as important as the wider picture.
Andrew, do you want to deal with this question of his war crimes?
Yes, very much. I rather fear that some people might mistake the idea that this book is a hagiography that doesn't ever criticize him. Of course it does, and the worst thing he did was to order the massacre of 3,000 prisoners of war after the Battle of Jaffa in March of 1799. These guys had surrendered to him earlier in the campaign when they were captured at El Arish in what is now the Gaza Strip, and they gave their promise, their parole, not to fight again, and then they did and were captured. Now, of course, morally, it was a monstrous thing to do, but I would take issue with the gentleman who said that it counts as a war crime, because under the actual terms of Middle Eastern conflict at that time, if you give your parole and then break it, your life is forfeit. It was the wrong thing to do. It was a terrible thing to do. It's a monstrous, moral crime, and he was a ruthless man. But that doesn't mean, any more than the things that Peter the Great or Catherine the Great or Frederick the Great did, that he should be stripped of the title he deserves.
But I will here add also the French under Napoleon did treat their prisoners of war far better than the British did.
I think that he also wanted to put the most key parts of the Enlightenment into as many countries as he was able to. And Adam was absolutely right that the brothers of his were pretty uniformly useless as kings. But the reason was not that he bullied them so much, was that because they were constant wars. They were wars that were, as I mentioned, started by the legitimist and ancien regime powers, not wars that he wanted. He presided over well over half of the meetings that set up the Code Napoleon, and when I say presided, he had something to say about absolutely everything. And he also provided, most importantly, Adam's absolutely right when he says that Cambacérès was the intellectual force behind it, but Cambacérès had been trying to get a code, a revision of the legal code, into French law since the French Revolution broke out, and nothing had happened for 15 years. What it needed, 10 years, sorry, what it needed, 15 by the time it got through, was a driving political force willing to cut the Gordian knot. And that's what Napoleon was. Now, with the question of primogeniture, which he himself, of course, his family had benefited from, because that was the only way that they'd managed to keep their estates together in Corsica. Yes, I think it's a very bad idea. I've always been against primogeniture. I'm the eldest brother, and my younger brother, who's in the audience here, is shaking his head, but there we are. The fact is that primogeniture is a way, in Britain certainly, that you kept estates together and you sent the youngest and poorest people off to the wars. But I think to blame Napoleon for the what has been blamed, things that happened literally a century after his death, such as the rise of German nationalism at the time of the First World War, really is going too far. And I think the case is the same for primogeniture.
The other thing we haven't talked about, I mean, mentioned, is his appalling, through censorship of the most vicious kind, his appalling effect on French letters. He basically shut up 2 generations of French literature.
We are wildly hypocritical about this. The Lord Chancellor had the right and exercised the right to censor theatrical productions in this country until 1968. He did it against Arthur Miller's plays, Pindarello's plays. Well, pretty much all the anti-government newspapers.
About
and the
60 newspapers.
Yeah, and how much genuine, it's wartime, how much genuine freedom of the press was there in this country in the Second World War. When Winston Churchill said that the truth needs to be protected by a bodyguard of lies, he understood exactly what Napoleon was trying to do.
Andrew, it wasn't a question of political things. You know, Madame de Staël wrote a book about German literature. You know, it had to be confiscated and burnt. The manuscript was pursued by the police. I mean,
The way in which you're treating him, like he's Madame de Staël was sent into internal exile. It is hardly a police state when you have one policeman for every 1,510 Frenchmen. In Britain today, we have one policeman for every 450 Britons. Does that make us a police state? No.
No, I didn't think...
Internal exile is a characteristic of a police state, isn't it?
It's a jolly sight better than being put in prison. At least she was able to live in her vast and beautiful mansion on the Lake Geneva, Lake Coppet. Yeah. Oh, fewer. No. That's not the case. The Ancien Regime and the French Revolution imprisoned more people than Napoleon. Which is that Adam's absolutely right that Talleyrand was a sneaky little weasel who financially bettered himself, who betrayed France, as you say, for money most of the time. But we all love him because he was witty. Well, there are plenty of people who were witty, and one of the questions was from the lady in the front there said, what were Napoleon's nicest traits or best traits? I think his sense of humour is something that took me by surprise. Really,
Tell us a Napoleon joke.
I've given you. I told you three actually in the course of my. Okay, a sort of cool joke that he came out with at the Battle of Wagram, when one of his aides-de-camp had his hat, his shako, shot off by cannonballs, which might imply that he was a small man, said, yeah, good job you're no taller. But to make jokes during a battle is amazing. He actually went to sleep for 15 minutes in the middle of the Battle of Wagram, where there are 1,000 cannons on both sides going off. And there's an extraordinary calmness and coolness to this man, which took me by surprise. There are 50 or 60 Napoleonic jokes in this book, and it's an aspect of him I wasn't expecting.
Spread over 900 pages. It's hard going, isn't it?
Not the reading of it, fortunately. And the very intelligent question from the gentleman over there about Elba, it's quite wrong to say that nobody welcomed him before Grenoble. Actually, at La Frie, he had a regiment fling themselves on him, and in one of the other towns, I think it was Sisteron, the common people of France, of the town anyway, just pulled down the gates and smashed them up and gave him bits of the gates to show that they didn't want him to be kept out of Sisteron. So, it's not fair. He's absolutely right when he says that the Bourbons ruined everything and screwed everything up in 10 months. But nonetheless, that wasn't the only reason that people welcomed him back in 1815.
What about this point that was made very early on, this very interesting point about the standards by which you judge whether someone's entitled to be considered great or not? Are they the standards of today or the standards of the time? You've argued a relativism right the way through your presentation.
No, I believe in both. I believe he was great both by the standards of the day and by the standards of today. But I don't believe that really history makes that much sense if you constantly just see it through the prism of the present day. And the fact is that we have seen Napoleon wrongly through the prism of the Second World War. Again and again, he's presented, especially by British historians, as a kind of proto-Hitler who was a totalitarian monster. He wasn't. You have to see him through the actual prism of the day.
And, he would have been a fan of the European Union, though, wouldn't he?
Yes, except Andrew,
because the European
in his
Union,
day, he was regarded as the ogre, as a sort of cheerleader.
By the people who were fighting against him, but you don't have to subscribe to political propaganda 200 years later.
He was at war with everybody, so of course they were.
He had the largest attack that ever took place in the history of the Napoleonic Wars was when he had 21 states on his side going into Russia. I know what happened there, but the fact is it was a bigger coalition than any that fought against him.
Right, Andrew will now tell us why we should have voted for the proposition that Napoleon should be called the Great.
Ladies and gentlemen, everyone who put in one of these black little cards is following in the tradition of Goethe, Hegel, Berlioz, Byron, Carlyle, the great intellectuals who appreciated that he was a bona fide intellectual, a connoisseur, a critic, a theorist of drama and music, a man who championed science, who socialized with astronomers, and who impressed these great men, as well as all of those of you who handed in this card. He was in the Enlightenment, ladies and gentlemen, on horseback. He abolished, wherever he or his armies went, they abolished feudalism, they rationalized countries, they abolished the Spanish Inquisition, and all the appalling backward things that had held Europe back for so long under the legitimists and the ancien regimes, of whom the spokesman, it seems tonight, is Count Adam Zamoyski. It's wonderful news, by the way, that he's writing a biography of Napoleon, and I am very much looking forward to reviewing it. But when one sees the effects of this great man and when they went into these towns, one of the first things they do, like in the Papal States, classic example, the Papal States, where Jews still had to wear the yellow star and where they were forced into ghettos, he not only opened up the ghettos, but he gave civil and religious rights and liberties to the Jews and to everyone else. This is a liberating concept, the idea of the Enlightenment on horseback. And for all of you who voted yes, you can feel yourself part of one of the great liberating Enlightenment traditions. Those of you who didn't, of course, are still stuck in the mire of reaction, legitimacy, and the ancien regime. Thank you very much indeed.